if you gents would like to introduce yourself, Tom, why don't you go first?
Sure. So I'm the managing director of Holgreen Digital, which is a WordPress agency specializing in working with purpose-led organizations. And we've been focused for many years on how we can minimize our own environmental impact as a company, but also in the last few years around like the environmental impact of digital and how do we quantify the carbon emissions of digital services.
Thanks. Aaron?
Sure. Hi, lovely to meet you all. My name is Aaron. I am co-founder and CTO at Supercritical. We're a business that helps companies get to net zero by measuring their climate impact and selling high quality carbon removal offsets.
And Ben?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending where you are. And lovely to be here and to meet you all. So I'm Ben. I'm head of environmental sustainability at Go Cardless. We are a fintech. I joined about 3 months ago now, but essentially, although fintech and sustainability and environmental probably doesn't necessarily sound that exciting, a big part of what we do is obviously reducing our own impact. So specifically what we're talking about today on emission reduction, but also then looking beyond that to what are the positive impacts of how can we use fintech for good. But yeah, so looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Nice to meet you again. Of course, we know each other, but everyone here probably doesn't know you as well. So I'm going to kick into some questions. For those of you that want to re-reference this, we do record, as you know, and we'll post this on our YouTube channel, but we also share the notes. So we will capture as much as we can possibly type down here in these notes I've just shared with you in the chat. If you want to pop a question in there, please feel free to do so as well. So I'm going to ask the first question. Matthew, if you wouldn't mind helping me type some of these out, but let's kick off with you, Ben, since you're on my screen right now. In your experience, can you give us a quick TLDR on emissions accounting? So thinking about explaining measurement, verification, reporting, and offsetting. Just give us the bird's eye view.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess from my point of view in terms of the corporate sustainability side of things, it's measuring your environmental impact, and so specifically your greenhouse gases or carbon reporting is probably the first really important step into developing a good environmentally sustainable strategy. So without understanding what your own impact is in terms of your emissions, it's quite difficult to then create any sort of meaningful change. So I think that first step is always really important in measuring, so you can actually take action. I guess, what does that look like at Go Cardless and in my previous roles in the sort of space sector as well? It's essentially looking across your whole business operations. Some of the terminology people will be familiar with is scope 1, 2, and 3. So essentially, what's your direct impact? So what are you physically putting out to the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gases? I think importantly is greenhouse gases is the key thing there, rather than just carbon, because it's not just about carbon dioxide, but typically it's referred to as carbon. But yeah, so scope 1, 2, and 3, so looking across your whole operations, but then also then looking at your value chain. So what you're using in terms of energy use. Have you got company vehicles? Have you got generators? Have you got air conditioning? All the way through to what you're using in terms of financial services, or probably importantly on this call, for software or hosting of your data and things like that. So it's essentially, what is your whole business impact, specifically in terms of greenhouse gases, if that answers the question.
I think it does. It's a very detailed bird's eye view. I love it. Tom or Aaron, Tom, do you want to jump in? Anything to add, or?
I mean, I think that pretty much covers it. I guess, maybe just something to say is obviously like different organizations are starting from different places, and and some things are a lot easier to quantify than others. Some things are very straightforward, some things are not so much. But I think we'll explore that probably as we go further into this conversation.
Definitely. Aaron?
Yeah, nothing to add. I think but I completely agree. I think like step one, measuring your footprint is absolutely the most important place to start.
And on that then, diving into the next question, there are a lot of resources and guidance out there on how to get started in calculations and reporting. What are the steps? What do you need to do versus what you can do? Like what degrees and levels of accuracy are needed, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I think there are kind of like two key routes to like measuring your footprint. I guess like the first one is you pay someone else to do it. You pay someone like us to handle this for you, you outsource it. Or second option is you do it yourself. And I'll focus more on that for the time being. But if you're doing it yourself, as a business owner, I think there's a few things you need to consider. One is that we've seen lots of companies do this. We've probably spoken to 100+ companies now who have like thought about it or have tried to measure their own footprint. And there's a couple of things there. One is like acknowledge the time investment in this. This is on average about 2 to 3 person months to measure your footprint. That's someone we see often. It's the like a marketing manager or like a HR manager that gets given this as like a job to do on the side. And so they're measuring the footprint, but they're also doing their day job. So it takes a few months to do. And they need to, Ben mentioned a few of these like sort of terminology points they need to know, but learn about what scope 1, 2, and 3 means, what the greenhouse gas protocol is, like go and gather this data across the organization. And then build a spreadsheet to be able to calculate their footprint and actually measure it themselves. There's a lot of work to do here. So I think step one would be like, if you're doing it yourself, acknowledge the cost in that. My advice would be beyond that is that keep it simple. So on your question about like how accurate does this need to be, I would say like an 80-20 approach is like healthy here. Like don't try and search for every last ton of carbon that you can find in your organization. We've footprinted many companies, and what we found generally across the board is that there are like the top 4 categories that account for 80+% of most businesses' emissions. Those are business travel. So if you fly a lot as an organization, that's like a huge contributor to your footprint. But that also includes things like train and taxi and tube and so on. So business travel is one of the categories you should focus on. Employee remote working, so the impact of your employees now working from home where they were previously in the office, which is like home heating, electricity. There's office utilities as a third category, which is everything to do with like powering your offices. So again, like aircon and heating, electricity, and then finally food and drink. And if you focus on those kind of like 4 categories when you're trying to like start this process of calculating your own footprint as a business, you'll probably get 80% of the information you need. And you won't get lost down this rabbit hole of trying to capture, as I say, every last ton.
That's really, really good advice. I like that you kind of broke it down into a couple of key categories. Start simple, don't be overwhelmed. Ben, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I completely agree with Aaron on that. It's I guess looking at I've got my data right in front of me because I've just been publishing our climate report internally. The majority of our emissions are in scope 3 for us, which is those kind of in our supply chain. But as part of that, it's attributed to 2 or 3 elements. So absolutely, trying to get down to that last kilogram is a little bit tricky. But I guess a couple of things that I've learned over the last few years and things I've heard, 2 phrases are really quite visually quite powerful. So one, someone said to me that it's kind of like sculpting. So you start with your rough outline of rock and then you gradually chisel away at it and make it more perfect and more refined. And I think that's exactly what carbon accounting is, because you start with rough estimates. So typically, for me, with our scope 3, we're using spend-based emissions, which are probably the least accurate, but it's a good captural way of doing it. And then you can go into more detail and get it more refined. But I think a phrase that I heard recently was, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good. So a lot of businesses will think, where do we start? How do we start? What do we do? And my view is we just start. Taking those first steps is the most important thing. It doesn't matter how well you're doing or how thoroughly you're capturing your business emissions, it's just important to make a start, and then you can year on year make improvements. As anyone who's ever done ISO standards, it always says to you continually improve, and it's the same thing. You review it, see how you can make it better. And actually, over the last week, we finished our 2020 baseline accounting report, and then I went back into it today, and there's a few things that I was improved on in the space of a week. So if you do that monthly or hourly, if you like, then you always make those improvements. So but yeah, so those two sort of visual examples are quite useful in terms of carbon accounting.
Yeah, that's really good. And Tom, and on Ben said, do you just have to make a start? How would you go about just starting, right? As a small business. Also, I know that you are B Corp, so you've had to prove this stuff. So how would you go about making that start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think exactly as Aaron said, I mean, the easiest way is going to be to hire somebody like Supercritical to do this for you, because it is a bit of a headache. And we've kind of built up to it over many years where, we were trying to do it 10 years ago. Probably what we were doing then was pretty rough back of an envelope, and then gradually we built out our own like spreadsheet model that had all of the things in, like the business travel and the office space usage, and we could put all our employees in there and have different data, and it ended up being super interesting, getting a little bit too complicated, and it, I think it's been great as an education path for us to actually learn about how this all works. But it is a real investment of time that not every company is able to invest. So I think if you're going to do it yourself and you don't have that time, then finding a tool to help you, either our spreadsheet is open, we can give it to anybody who wants it, we can put it in the notes after the event, or there's some online softwares that give, they're not super precise necessarily, but things like compareyourfootprint.com are kind of tools to get you started if you're a small business and you want to just get a rough idea of, okay, this is our office space, this is our business travel, things that you can fill in a sort of relatively intuitive format, I think are a good starting point. Yeah.
You've just gone ahead and answered, all of you, the two questions. And my next question is, how would you do this as a small business? Hire someone or start with some of the tools that are out there? So what sorts of pitfalls and misconceptions have you seen? I mean, I mentioned, there are tons of things out there. Getting caught down the rabbit hole, Ben, you mentioned. What are some other pitfalls and misconceptions you've seen out there about doing this for yourself or your business? Tom, since you're on my screen, go with you.
I mean, I think the pitfalls are, the biggest pitfall is really, I think, running out of time and not doing it at all. And even for us, we're really committed to it. And every year we're banging our heads against the wall saying, oh no, we're 6 months behind schedule again. Because it's just a big sink of time. I think on the practical level, I think it's just really easy to miss things and not really know what it is that you need to be accounting for. So I think starting with some sort of template, ideally one that covers the 4 big things that Aaron mentioned, possibly, some others like purchases, Ben mentioned spend-based emissions calculations. I think just a template that gets you started is the easiest thing, because otherwise you're kind of shooting in the dark as to well, what do we measure? What should we include? And you're bound to miss something important.
Yeah, absolutely. Ben, please jump in. I see you just come off mute.
Yeah, I guess, obviously I have the slight luxury that I sit in a slightly bigger organization, but something that's quite useful, and again, I sit within the finance team, which probably doesn't sound particularly exciting in this conversation, but it means that I've got access to really good data. So I think 2 things that are really important from what I've learned is data and people are really important in this process. So one, being able to get, for example, access to our financials, I can basically go through that. It sounds really boring, but go through that and see exactly where we're spending money, because then that generally tells you where a lot of your emissions are, and you can actually then, a little bit like going down the rabbit hole, you can then break that out into categories and then get a really good, accurate scope of where your emissions are. So that's, if you can get that data, then that's great, and that's a kind of a good net so that you don't miss things, because that's sometimes that's the problem sometimes with emissions accounting, is that it's easy to miss things because you don't actually know what you're looking for. So when I first started this process a few years ago, I was thinking, why does insurance count as emissions? But then you realize that everything that you do as a business has a related emission tied to it. So I think that's quite useful. But then I think also my first thing I did when I joined GoCardless was just speaking to as many people across the business as possible to try and visualize or physically draw out on the back of a bit of paper how the business works as a system. So you kind of see what the inputs are, what the outputs are, who the key suppliers are, customers, that sort of thing. And that's a really good way to see it, because once you visualize your business in that in, out, up, down, sideways type system, then you can kind of see where the emissions are, and in the long term you can see where savings can be. There's a really good story that goes around sort of sustainability circuits about British Sugar, which some of you might have heard this, but they modeled their business as a system, and they realized one of the biggest waste outputs they had was CO2 from their production. So they built a load of greenhouses and then grew tomatoes, and then ended up making more money from growing tomatoes than making sugar. So it's modeling your business sometimes as that system is quite a useful way of doing it. So but yeah, I went off on tangent there, sorry. So, sleep deprivation from the baby in the house. So.
It's okay. You definitely gave Aaron a lot to run with. That's for sure. Aaron, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I just totally agree with both Ben and Tom's points. I love Tom's point about like writing up your list of what you're going to focus on, and Ben's point about looking at your spend. One of the things that we do is when we work with businesses is we get their account transactions reports. So we get like a summary of their spend over the year, and we order that, and we can actually see, when we work with businesses and they've measured their footprint themselves, they're very excited to tell us that they have installed like utilities to reduce water waste, or they've swapped out their plastic straws for like metal straws and so on in their offices. And what we find is that that's like half a ton total every year. And then they haven't told us they've spent £5 million on online advertising, which has like 100+ tons of emissions associated with it. So I think, just to reiterate both Ben and Tom's points, like 100%, if data can drive your decision making, it will prevent you from being distracted from like the accidental greenwashing of like plastic straws and plastic bags and the other stuff that's important for other reasons, but not for reducing your footprint.
That's awesome. Hilarious, actually. So moving on from calculation on to targets. So a question that I had personally whilst going about doing this myself and trying to weed through all of the resources out there. I think, Ben, you and I have had this conversation, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on SBTI, right? So Science-Based Target Initiative. So what role do they play within the broader context of this, for smaller businesses, larger businesses? It is a cost incurred. Ben, I know you have some thoughts and you're probably jumping at the bit to jump in on this one. There is a cost to doing SBTI. So what role do they play, and is it for everyone?
Yeah, I can comment on that if you want. So I guess for context, for those on the call who might not be familiar, so SBTI is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and it's a coalition between, I think, CDP, the WWF, and a few other sort of big sustainability type entities, if that's the right way to phrase that. I guess from my point of view, that for corporations to take meaningful climate action, all strategies need to be science aligned regardless. I think without probably trying to go into it in too much, because most people on the call joining a ClimateAction.tech will be familiar with the need to take action on climate change. I think there's certainly businesses out there setting goals which don't really align with any sort of science that's needed, and so I think the Science-Based Targets Initiative is a great, I guess, north point on a compass, as it were, for guiding business to what they need to be doing, to basically really to limit the worst effects of climate change. So at Go Carlos, we actually committed last week to the 1.5 degrees business ambition for 1.5 degrees, which essentially is making sure that you reduce your emissions first and foremost in line with the Paris Agreement and the need to keep global temperature rise below 1.5. I think it's the new net zero standard that's coming out from SBTi is going to be very ambitious, probably for a lot of businesses. I spoke to a couple today actually, and I think some of it, I think they're thinking, how on earth do we do this? But then I think my view is, well, we don't really have much choice. I think the important thing is for business is to understand those emissions reductions, both from a climate point of view, but also from a business point of view, because if you're a business that continues to operate as a high carbon business in 5, 10, 15 years time, one, you're going to be at risk, I could go into some massive detail, but also probably customers or employees aren't going to be attracted to your business. So companies need to decarbonize regardless of whatever their motive. But I think the SBTi certainly provides that framework of how to do it. And probably in the next few years, it's going to become the standard, I guess, on net zero and corporate net zero, and what does that look like? So from my point of view, it's certainly a challenge. I've got to look at how do we develop our SBTi net zero target. But yeah, it's a challenge that I'm looking forward to, I think.
Yeah, Aaron, what are your thoughts on SBTi? Those are some, what are your thoughts?
So I think that, and I know that SBTi is like best in class, I guess, as far as with regards to how to get to net zero. I think for people like Ben at Go Cardless, it serves them very well, because it's they've got different categories of business that they're providing sort of tailored advice for. So like financial services is an example of that, and manufacturing is another example. What I would say is that it is best in class, but I would say that for lots of companies that we work with, it's not really geared yet towards like smaller tech companies and smaller businesses. Now that's in progress, so like we need to be patient, and that's coming. But it's a case of waiting for that right now. So it's not friendly practical advice right now for a 20-person software company, for example. But massive respect for what they're doing, and I think that SBTi is sort of framing of net zero around reduction and removals is like absolutely key, and every business should be thinking about how you reduce your emissions, then how you offset the emissions you can't reduce with removal offsets. And I think that they're like really pushing those 2 points, which is great.
Yeah, this is exactly what I wanted. Two completely varying levels of perspective. Tom, somewhere in the middle, what would you add to that?
Well, I completely agree with both, in that we need whatever action we take, it's got to be based on the science. And I think SBTi is a sort of a great initiative, if initiative is the right word for it. But I also agree with Aaron that for a lot of organizations, it's not necessarily very accessible. I mean, like I literally run a 20-person software agency, and and we found it like, okay, we're not quite sure like what this even means for us, and but it doesn't mean that you can't kind of take the concept and try to apply it in a more generalized sort of way, without necessarily getting into all of the detail. I think it would be great if it was accessible to smaller companies, so you could actually say, well, look, we want to set a target. What sort of target should we set? That's really what we need. But I think small businesses need something that's really simple and kind of lays it on a plate for them. And I don't think it does that yet as a sort of initiative.
Yeah, especially if you can't go about hiring someone, it is somebody's side job, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that person whose side job it is probably like still struggling to get to grips with things like scope 1, 2, and 3, and general terminology. And then there's like this science-based targets thing. And they're like, what?
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much. I'm conscious I have a couple of more questions, but we have like loads of questions coming in from the audience. Melissa's raised her hand. Since you've raised, I'll pop you onto the floor. And then if you have any other questions, like I said, if you are happy to raise them yourselves to the panelists, please feel free to come off mute, but we do operate by Chatham House rules. So if you are not comfortable with associating yourself with questions, please ask them anonymously, and I'll pose them to the panelists myself. But Melissa, do you want to jump in?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say, for people who haven't checked out SBTI, they have like a spreadsheet, right? You can download it and you can still use it as a way to sort of gauge how much your emissions should decrease. So like, however you're accurate or not accurate your estimates are, it's still sort of like a guidepost. So I think it's still worth looking at.
Great point. Very good point. I'm going to field some of the questions here. So our first question, my company is worried about miscalculating our emissions and being accused of greenwashing. If we share a too low number publicly, any advice? Please.
I would say the bit to worry about is not, if you can worry about one thing, the bit to worry about is not the footprinting, because most companies aren't footprinting. So you're going from 0 to 1, you're doing something, which I think both Ben and Tom myself have all covered. What I would say, the thing to be concerned about with regards to accusations of greenwashing is like what you do off the back of that. And what that is really is like, what type of offsets do you buy as a result of the footprint you calculated, whether it's plus or minus 100%, or 50% incorrect kind of thing. Offsets themselves come in a couple of different categories. You've got these kind of conventional offsets, which the very short, like TLDR of the conventional offsets is they're not good enough, frankly. And then you have removal offsets, which is a slightly, newer category in some ways of offset that actually removes your emissions from the atmosphere. And so I think the companies are more likely to be scrutinized for how they spend their money as a result of the footprinting than the footprinting itself. And I'm happy to talk more about sort of the distinction between those offset types. That's helpful.
Yeah, that is helpful. And if Ben, Tom, you want to jump in and add anything, and on that as well, thinking about offsets, if there's also, there's a conventional removal, gold standard, what sorts of things should you be looking for when you get down that route? Tom, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I mean, just on the kind of the concern around what if your calculations aren't accurate enough and people accuse you of greenwashing, I think one thing that's really important is transparency around how you've done it, because I think a lot of companies are just sort of communicating numbers and saying, here's our number, but they don't tell you any of the workings behind it, and you really don't know how accurate it is at all. And if you've done this yourselves, you know exactly what's gone into it, and it's a relatively easy thing to do, to tell that story. And you don't have to give every detail, but to just be honest about, these are things we've done, these are challenges we faced, these are the things we were unsure about. And I think actually, if you're just honest about the bits where actually maybe it was a bit flaky and you didn't have the information and you didn't know how to work it out, but you also said, look, we did know these things and we calculated them, I think people really respect that. And I think then, you don't have to worry so much about being accused of greenwashing, because people will be able to see that you're really genuine and you're not trying to hide anything.
Cool. Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Aaron and Tom say on that. I think transparency is really, really key. So the report that we've just been creating for our 2020 baseline year, I guess, is we start off by saying what we're trying to achieve. We set out our scope. We go through how we're going to measure it. So against the GHG protocol, for example, we define what the scopes are. So it's kind of, this is what we want to do, this is how we're doing it. And then we actually go through every line item, almost saying how we've measured that, even down to what emission factors we've been using. So if it's energy, are we using DEFRA emissions factors or IEA, that sort of thing, all the way through to our spend base. So actually what I did on my spend based emissions, just because there's not really much guidance out there, I kind of took the average of DEFRA and then the GHG protocol one that I just shared in the chat, some environmental impact output methods. I took all these different factors, averaged them out to try and get the best and most accurate conversion factor for that element, but then actually putting that in the report, say this is how we've done it. We know it's not 100% accurate, but this is how we look to improve. And at the end of the report, we say this is the things that we haven't been able to capture. So I think we had sort of 3 items we couldn't get any data on. So in our actions for next year or this year, we want to find this data and we want to improve this. So I think transparency and showing the willingness to improve on that is the most important thing. And then you absolutely can't be accused of greenwashing or missing things as long as you're transparent. And I guess the follow-on step from that in terms of greenwashing is just making sure that whatever you're claiming against those the calculations is is again transparent and responsible, I guess. So I mean, if I measured the go cardless emissions and then said, oh yeah, great, we are I don't know, we'll be carbon neutral tomorrow, for example, but it's making sure that whatever your claims are, you're basing it on what your actual data is there and what you're actually going to be doing, rather than just I guess just greenwashing literally.
No, absolutely. And how, the next question is perfect follow on to this. How do you communicate these results internally? So we're talking about externally being perceived as greenwashing and how you're transparent, but how do you communicate them internally? What has the reception been like for all of your businesses, and are employees engaged in working to reduce these emissions, or is the decarbonization plan more limited to specific departments like purchasing and operations? So whomever wants to jump in on that one.
I can go again if you want. I guess one of the reasons why I joined Go Cardless was because there was already quite a high level of engagement amongst the team. I think the buy-in from the top was already there. So our CEO and CFO were the instigators of our net zero strategy starting earlier in the year. But then I think we've got around 100 or so GCs, as we call ourselves, in a dedicated Slack channel, all about specifically net zero and carbon reduction. So there's a lot of engagement, but I think my day 3 within the business, I was asked to present to a town hall, which I didn't really know what that meant. I said, sure, I'll do that. And it was the whole business and just talking about the strategy. But more importantly, I just asked for everyone's ideas and feedback. But to try and get everyone involved across the business. So I guess importantly for me, it's about embedding it across everyone. So it's not just me trying to do it from the side. It's how do we get someone in IT or HR or finance all seeing that through their day job through the lens of sustainability and specifically carbon reduction. So we're creating things like workshops and engagement days. We're creating a forum, which is volunteer people that can join. We meet every 3 months to come and talk about sustainability, how they can put that into their roles. But then we kind of reward them with training and accreditation to IEMA and things like that. So they're incentivized to actually take that on. But then the more, I guess, the sticks rather than the carrots are things like sustainable travel policies to look at corporate travel or procurement and things like that. Because again, for us, scope 3 is so big that a lot of it is outside our control. So that's going to come down to supply chain management and things like that, which don't sound particularly exciting. But I think, you know, my view for all businesses is try and embed it throughout the organization wherever you can, and that's the key to make a business sustainable, rather than just doing sustainability. That sounded really marketing-y, didn't it? But that's I'll stop there.
That's how you get everybody involved. You have to go down into the tech and up into the fluff, don't you? Tom, Aaron, anything to add on that?
I mean, I completely agree with everything Ben said. I think it's one of the things we've been trying to do is try to sort of remove this sort of mental barrier between like personal emissions and corporate emissions, and actually get people involved with it as a team in talking about, you know, their own lifestyles and how that has an impact. Because I think once they start thinking about that, then it naturally just translates also into the things that they're doing at work. So for example, we use Donation, which is like an online platform, where people can make kind of lifestyle pledges, and you have competitions and things. And it surprisingly seems to actually get, at least in our team, they seem to have a competitive spirit, and they like to compete on these things. So that's quite interesting. But then equally, just like embedding things as standard, as Ben said, through things like just like corporate policies and processes, that can kind of just make things routine, where people don't have to think about it every time. It's just the way it's always done. And once you've got that kind of working, it makes things a lot easier ongoing. I think the biggest headache for us is really the areas that are kind of outside of visibility. So like a big area to look at is like home working, as has been mentioned already. Not in terms of calculation so much, but in terms of the reality, because, you know, you can't see inside people's homes, and then there's a privacy issue and so on. But also, like if you have like some people in the team who maybe like they're just not that interested, but they might be in a key position where they are actually like procuring things, and you might have a procurement policy, but when it comes down to it, they have the autonomy to go make the decision and buy things. So I think, you know, that's a challenge that I'm sure a lot of organizations face, is like just aligning policy with reality, and just trying to build that culture to make sure that there's a feedback loop. Things are never going to be perfect, but as long as people are kind of spotting where something's gone slightly off track and then actually having a conversation about it, I think that gradually kind of makes things more effective.
Adding to that, and Aaron, I'll pass on to you for kind of an amalgamation of both of these questions. Have you seen any instances of any frameworks being used and successfully pitched where leadership wasn't already bought in? So in addition to bringing the team on board, bringing leadership on board, and any potential tips on pitching that case?
Such a great question. I think, so I have two thoughts on that. I think the first one, the reality is that for most businesses for all businesses that we work with, it's driven from the top. So if leadership isn't on board, then it ain't going to work. Basically, like the business is not going to have the impact they need and reduce their climate impact and offset and so on. So, you know, the businesses we work with generally, as Ben described, it's like CEO and C-level are excited and driving this, and they understand the problems and they want to push us forward. So that's the happy path. They just get it and they're pushing for it, and it happens. To your question of like how can you like sort of stimulate that from the team, like maybe convincing the business it's worth doing. It's a great question. I think that what we see and how we talk about it is that climate is like the next diversity and inclusion. So this is not optional anymore. You know, employees, every company we work with, the employees are really engaged. And to Ben's point about like having a team at GoCars with like a Slack channel where they're sharing, the companies we work with, they all have a version of that. So it's happening organically in the team. You see that the employees are like motivated, engaged, and they're going to start doing it whether C-level are involved or not. But I think the way to try and convince business that, you know, the leaders in businesses to engage with this and to drive this is to treat it as a next diversity inclusion. It's like something that has to happen. Your business will be left behind if you're not building a climate business, like you need to build a D&I business. You need to retain your employees, you need to hire new employees, and you need to be a good company, much in the same way that B Corp, as Tom will know about, it's like a really important signal to the outside world. So I think if you're an employee in a business, like the grassroots movement is to like convince your leaders that it's crucial from like a hiring, a retaining talent perspective, and so on. So there's so many aspects of that that are honestly difficult probably to communicate, but are the realities as well.
Absolutely, totally, 100% agree. And Ben, anything to add? Tom, anything to add from a leadership perspective?
I guess, much like Aaron said, actually, I think it's about almost understanding your audience. If you're trying to get executive, or not even necessarily executive buy-in, but I think if I'm thinking back to some of my previous roles where speaking to CFOs or CEOs or chief human resource officers and things like that, who probably have a lot on their plate already, and the last thing they want is me knocking on the door going, what are we doing about climate change? And but I think it's understanding their language. So if you're speaking to your head of human resources, for example, is that they're not necessarily going to be interested in how many pounds can we save through making efficiencies in our energy use, but they'll probably be interested in the story about I think something like 67% of graduates now look at a company's sustainability policy before applying for a job, for example, or you've got the staff retention aspect of it. So most businesses, I'm sure, if they suddenly start going burning drums of oil in their car park, most employees will probably leave, much in the same way as Aaron mentioned, in terms of D&I policies, things like that. But then I think if you communicate to your CFO that coming down the line, we've got TCFD, Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, for example, businesses will be having to report on their financial risk related to climate, but then on the other side, you've got attracting investors, reducing costs. So CFOs love that. You talk to them in pound signs as opposed to people signs. But then if you're talking to someone about reputation or marketing, then you've got the completely different story based around that as well. So I think it's understanding who you're talking to at that level to get that buy-in based on what's important to them is really quite key. And I think, like Aaron mentioned, actually, it's inevitable. If you're a business that doesn't take action on climate, net zero will be, it will happen whether we're on board with it or not. The planet will get to such a state where we have to reduce our emissions, or we all reduce our emissions and reach net zero. So I think the businesses that will be around to be prosperous and economically sustainable will be the ones that have a wider sustainability policy based on climate and people. Also, probably not one to go on about tonight, but is biodiversity and nature and things like that, because everything's all completely interlinked, and that's probably a topic for another day. But I will stop there.
I'm conscious of time and we have 10 minutes left. So Tom, I'm going to assume that you're going to echo the thoughts, but if you have anything next, jump in. So there's two questions that are quite similar. So I'm going to try to mash them up, kind of back to transparency and Ben with people thing. I'd be interested to know whether there are any easy emissions accounting for small projects. I kickstarted a climate solutions game last year and have a difficult time in figuring out how much to offset for the project. The advice I've gotten is that it would cost way more to just hire someone to do the calculations than to make the offsets. And also, would you say that maybe third parties or services or certifications can help with these sort of things? I know that's a mouthful and a big one, but they're in the doc. Aaron, do you want to, or Tom, do you want to jump in? Whomever.
I mean, there's a really interesting question, actually, and I do think that's true in some cases. The amount of money, and if you just look at purely financially, the amount of money that goes into calculating the emissions is probably significantly more than the cost of offsets. And I personally think that most offsets are like way too cheap, and probably think Aaron would probably agree with me that might be because they're low quality, but it's very hard to kind of tell what goes behind them. So there could be an argument from particularly from a small business point of view to say, well, you know, why don't we just invest money in doing things good, good for nature, rather than spending money paying a consultant to calculate our emissions. And I think that would actually be probably a fair thing to do. But if you can do both, and you can find a way of an easy, low cost way of calculating, if that's kind of the situation you're in, that you need to do it kind of quickly and cheaply. And I may have misunderstood the question in this context, but that's sort of what I thought I was hearing. Then I think if you can find an online tool or a spreadsheet that's kind of available for free online, and you can fill in things to get a good idea of the ballpark that you're in and what the key areas of impact are, then I think that's kind of a good best of both worlds. I don't think you always have to go into detail and do everything perfectly.
Please.
Yeah, I would. I agree with that, and I think obviously you need to be sensible with, depending on the size of your team, your company, and so on, as to what your approach is. If you're a one-person shop or a 5-person team, your approach to, you're not going to spend £10,000 plus on a consultancy to measure your footprint. That just absolutely wouldn't make sense. But also to one of the points I made at the very beginning of this conversation was don't underestimate how much effort is involved in actually calculating a footprint yourself, to the extent you need to accurately. Again, to another point, and I think Tom touched upon this, but 85% of conventional offsets don't have an impact. They don't have the impact they're supposed to. They're not additive. They're not additional. Sorry, so they can't be used in any kind of net zero claim. And that's a really important point to remember here, is that when you are spending money, actually most offsets are so cheap because they're not having an impact. So it's really important to, again, know that distinction of the type of offset you're spending your money on. If you're spending money, spend it on removal offsets if you can. You can still pay for cheaper removal offsets, like planting trees. They're actually pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They're less permanent. We're talking about 60 years, not 100+ years, but they are drawing carbon out of the sky. Not necessarily offsets like clean cook stoves, where you're paying for someone else to not emit, but your ton of CO2 is already in the atmosphere. So I would really focus on the quality of the offset that you're spending money on, and focus on removal offsets. I really want to hammer that home. It's so important to focus on the quality of the offsets you're buying, and on the spend of calculating a footprint. It's common sense approach. Focus on the big 3 or 4 categories that make sense to you. Don't get lost spending months trying to calculate every last ton or every last kilogram of CO2, and really focus on the big categories that will move the needle.
That's really, really good advice. And anything you would add, Ben, on the offset side?
Yeah, I think it was actually a really interesting question, actually, because it got me thinking, how much energy have I used, literally, kilowatt hours, in terms of calculating our emissions? It's just our interest, but it's kind of like a life cycle question, isn't it? Because I had a colleague who said, "Oh, can't we just put a solar panel on the roof of our office to balance out what we're using from the grid, for example?" But I did a case study in my previous role where we had some assets in the Arctic, and we said, "Oh, we should probably put some on-site generation here." But then the actual carbon cost of getting those, a wind turbine, for example, built and transported there, we wouldn't have got paid back in the actual emission savings. So it's never quite an easy answer. But I think on the offset point, I fully agree with Aaron on removals. I think the only thing I'd probably add to that, just from, I guess I mentioned biodiversity there, is just making sure that if there are certain schemes out there which have got bad press through creating monocrops and actually cause more harm on biodiversity and also communities as well. So it's making sure that in the path to going for carbon removal, you're not then causing harm on communities or ecosystems and that sort of thing. It's probably making sure this all taken into account in the round. But I think an interesting thing that someone told me recently was, if you took all of the corporate net zero pledges and everyone relied on offsets and removals, then we probably wouldn't have enough space to grow any food anymore. So I think that's why, importantly, the reduction is the most important thing first and foremost before those removals. But then in the wider context, an analogy someone I know told me is that if you walk past your local park every day and chuck in a bag of rubbish, but then in 2030 you just suddenly stop chucking it in there, it's still full of rubbish. So hence why removals and things like climate positive and tackling your historical emissions are really important, but just making sure that, I guess, there's enough of those removals left for the sectors that really need it. I guess cement production, agriculture, that sort of thing. Whereas me as a fintech, I could probably do a lot of it, just through some hard work and working with supply chains. But I think my thing would be, if you're doing removals, just make sure you're considering the ecosystems and the people, which sounds very very leftist of me right now, but I will stop there.
I think that is a perfect way to wrap everything up, right? Reduction before removals. Someone said we're not going to offset our way out of this, which is completely true. You're all really preaching to the choir, but like giving these really practical bits of advice is so helpful. I'm conscious we only have a couple of minutes left, but I just want to leave it out for a second. If there are any questions, please use the raise your hand button. I'd be really interested as well. In the meantime, we've got a couple minutes. Please share any resources either in the chat or in the document. We'll be publishing this along with the recording within the Slack group. Any more questions for the panel, please let us know. Tom, raise your hand. You don't need to raise your hand.
Yeah, I thought I raised my hand. I have a question for Aaron, if I may, which is, and Ben may also have good ideas on this. If people are looking for these high quality offsets, like where should they look, and how do they know that they're high quality and that they're not the 85% that are not delivering what they claim?
Yeah, great question. It's hard to answer this without plugging my own company, but we sell those higher quality removal offsets, and what we do, like our value add, is that we've effectively vet a large number. We've got a long list of companies that are selling offsets with things like direct air capture through to tree planting and bio oil and biochar in between as well. And we work with a smaller list that meet our standards, with our climate lead basically vetting and verifying them. I would say that, so if you want to buy from businesses like ours, you should do that. And we're like the right people to advise and guide you through that process. As like a general rule of thumb, you should think about price when you're in, which I think is something that you mentioned as well, Tom. If it feels too cheap, it probably is, and it's probably not having the impact you hope it's going to have. Removal offsets are not cheap. If you start with natural solutions like tree planting, they absolutely are more affordable, and you can be looking at 15-20 pounds a ton for tree removals, the higher quality ones, through to, we're talking about 500+ pounds for a ton of direct air capture. So it's absolutely, like, price is indicative of the quality you're getting to some extent, and also the nascency of the industry. Direct air capture is so much more expensive right now because it's new and it needs to be scaled. But I would say if you're buying offsets that are £2 to £3 a ton, they're probably not having the impact you hope they're going to have. And you need to be willing to spend a bit more money on some high quality removals.
Sorry, I just realized, Tom, you also mentioned my name on that question, didn't you? So I haven't gone massively far down the road of looking at removals and things, because that's probably a little bit further away down our strategy. But I know, well, I guess a declaration of interest. I've already spoken to Aaron's company on removals, but Also, I guess woodland carbon code is always a good, because Aaron, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's verified carbon removals, which is good. But I think I'm just going to give a little plug for phytoplankton here as well, just because, you know, if anyone in the tech community can find a way that can boost whale populations or phytoplankton, they currently absorb 40% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. So we can boost phytoplankton, the equivalent of 4 Amazon rainforests, then, you know, that might go some way to solving some of the problems. But just put that one out as a challenge.
I'll be looking up how to do that just after this. If you have any resources, then pop them in. If you've seen any. Well, we are at time. I would love for this to go for another hour, but I'm conscious that, you know, everybody has a life. Yeah, thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us and for this the conversation. Thank you everybody for the questions and the practical advice. We'll be capturing all of the notes and the recordings and sharing them off into the Slack channel and on our YouTube. So with that, I will thank you and let you go all enjoy the rest of your evening or day or morning, wherever you are. So thank you, everybody.